Easter Sunday, 5th of April 2015. The skies above Wiltshire are clear. It's the kind of morning skydivers hope for. Bright, calm, almost peaceful. Far below, families are enjoying the bank holiday weekend. Children search gardens for Easter eggs. Couples stroll through villages and countryside lanes. For most people, it is an ordinary Sunday. But thousands of feet above the ground, a woman is about to enter a nightmare. Her name is Victoria Cilliers. She's not a novice. She's not a thrill seeker ticking something off a bucket list. Victoria is an experienced skydiver, an army physiotherapist, a woman who has completed thousands of jumps and understands exactly what she's doing. Nothing about today should be dangerous. Nothing about today should be remarkable. As a small aircraft climbs over the Wiltshire countryside, Victoria makes her final checks. The routine is familiar. The equipment is familiar. The feeling is familiar. When the moment comes, she moves towards the open door. Then, she steps out. Instantly, she is swallowed by open sky. The roar of the wind fills her ears. The ground begins to drift away. For a few precious seconds, everything feels exactly as it should. Then she reaches for a parachute, and nothing happens. The main canopy fails. Years of training take over. No panic, no screaming, no hesitation. Victoria immediately moves to her reserve parachute. This is the backup, the safety net, the system designed to save your life when everything else goes wrong. She pulls. The reserve begins to deploy. Then it collapses. Something is terribly wrong. Now the reality hits her. 2 parachutes have failed. 2. The odds are almost impossible. And there is no third chance. No backup for the backup. Only 4,000 feet of empty air between her and the ground. Witnesses below begin to realise something is wrong. Some stare upward in disbelief. Others can do nothing but watch. Victoria is falling at well over 100 miles an hour. Seconds remain. Then, impact. The force is devastating. Bones shatter, organs are damaged. The injuries are so severe that many who see the aftermath assume they are witnessing a fatality. Yet somehow, impossibly, Victoria Cilliers survives. As emergency crews rush to the scene, nobody yet knows they are standing at the beginning of one of Britain's most extraordinary criminal investigations. At first, it looks like a tragic accident, a freak event, an appalling stroke of bad luck. But investigators soon discover something that changes everything. Parachutes don't usually fail, and neither do reserve parachutes. Not like this. The deeper they dig, the more disturbing the truth becomes. Because Victoria Cilliers did not simply survive a fall from the sky. According to a jury, somebody had tried to murder her, and the person accused of planning her death was the man waiting for news of her survival. Her husband, Emile Cilliers. Welcome back to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I'm your host, Matt. If you'd like to support the show, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. You can also follow the podcast on all social media platforms. And if you'd like to suggest a case or get in touch, you can email the show using the address in the description. And as always, if you enjoy the podcast, please consider following, rating, reviewing and sharing it. It genuinely helps more people discover the show and allows me to keep bringing these stories to a wider audience. Before we begin, this episode contains discussions of attempted murder, coercive control, infidelity, psychological manipulation and serious physical injury. Listener discretion is strongly advised. Alright, let's crack on with the show. When we think about murder investigations, we often imagine blood-stained crime scenes, missing persons report, or bodies discovered in remote places. We don't usually think about blue skies. We don't usually think about open countryside. And we certainly don't think about a woman falling from 4,000 feet and somehow surviving. But that's exactly where this story begins. On Easter Sunday in 2015, Victoria Cilliers stepped from an aircraft expecting to enjoy a routine skydive. Within moments, both of her parachutes had failed. Against all odds, she survived. At first, it looked like a tragic accident, a freak event so rare that many struggled to comprehend it. But as investigators began examining the evidence, a disturbing possibility emerged. What if this wasn't an accident at all? What if somebody had carefully planned it? And what if the person responsible was the one person Victoria should have been able to trust completely? This is the story of survival, deception, manipulation, and an attempted murder plot. So audacious that it sounds like the script of a Hollywood thriller, except every word of it is true. This is the Victoria Cilliers case, and this is what they hide: hidden crimes in plain sight. To the outside world, Victoria Cilliers appeared to have built a life many people would envy. She was intelligent, successful, adventurous and respected. A dedicated army physiotherapist, she had spent years helping injured soldiers recover from both physical and psychological trauma. The work demanded patience, resilience and professionalism. Those who knew her described someone who was capable, driven and compassionate. She was also a woman who embraced challenges. Among her passions was skydiving, not as a casual hobby, but as a serious commitment. Over the years, she had completed thousands of jumps. She understood the equipment, the procedures and the risks. In the skydiving community, she wasn't viewed as a novice or a thrill seeker. She was experienced and trusted. The sky was a place where she felt free, a place where she felt in control, a place where she belonged. By the early 2010s, Victoria seemed to have achieved a balance between professional success and family life. She was married to an army sergeant named Emile Cilliers. Together they were raising 2 children. Photographs from the period show a smiling family, holidays, special occasions, days out, the sort of images that populate countless family albums across Britain. Nothing appears unusual, nothing appears threatening, and that's important to remember. Because when people later look back at this case, many search for obvious warning signs. They search for clues that disaster was approaching. But life rarely works that way. The truth is that many dangerous relationships don't look dangerous from the outside. The people living inside them often don't recognise what is happening until much later. Victoria first met Emile through their military connections. He was charismatic, confident, the sort of man who could walk into a room and quickly become the centre of attention. Friends and colleagues often found him charming. He knew how to make people laugh. He knew how to make people feel important. Most of all, he knew how to create the impression that he was exactly the person others wanted him to be. For Victoria, the relationship developed quickly. Like many couples, they built a future together. Marriage followed, then children, the ordinary milestone that formed the foundation of family life. And for a time, that future appeared secure. Yet beneath the surface, something very different was beginning to develop. Unknown to Victoria, Emile was becoming increasingly skilled at living separate lives. Different versions of himself existed for different audiences. A devoted husband, the caring father, the respected soldier, the loyal friend, each role carefully maintained, each image carefully protected. The problem with deception is that it often succeeds because it contains enough truth to appear convincing. Those around Emile saw the parts he wanted them to see. the parts that made sense, the parts that fit the image. What they couldn't see were the growing secrets accumulating in the background. Financial problems, lies, manipulation, relationships hidden from those closest to him. The warning signs weren't obvious enough to trigger alarm. Not yet. Instead, they existed as small moments, small concerns, the kind of incidents that can easily be explained away. The kind that many people dismiss because they don't want to believe something darker may be hiding underneath. For Victoria, life continued. She focused on her work. She focused on her children. She focused on her marriage. And like countless people in long-term relationships, she trusted the person sharing her home. Trusted the person sleeping beside her. Trusted the person helping raise her children. She had no reason not to. At least, no reason she could yet see. Years later, investigators would painstakingly reconstruct what was happening behind the scenes during this period. The picture that emerged was not one of marriage suddenly collapsing. It was something far more complicated. A gradual erosion of trust, a web of deception growing larger with every passing month. The foundations of a life that looked stable from the outside, but was becoming increasingly fragile underneath. And while Victoria remained unaware of the full extent of what was happening, events were already moving towards a devastating conclusion. Because somewhere within that carefully constructed family life, somebody was beginning to see a spouse not as a partner, but as a problem. A problem that in time they would allegedly decide needed a permanent solution. And long before anyone examined a parachute, long before detectives arrived, long before a courtroom heard the evidence, the first cracks were already beginning to appear. The perfect life wasn't perfect at all. It only looked that way. And in the years ahead, that illusion would shatter completely. Relationships rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. More often, they deteriorate quietly. A lie here, a secret there, a promise broken and then repaired, a concern raised and then dismissed. The changes are often so gradual that the people living through them barely notice them happening. For Victoria Cilliers, the marriage she had built with Emil was beginning to show signs of strain. But from the outside, little appeared unusual. They were a military family. Life could be stressful. Deployments, work commitments, financial pressures, and the challenge of raising children all placed demands on a relationship. Many couples faced similar difficulties. There was nothing, at least initially, that suggested they were heading towards catastrophe. Yet beneath the surface, Emil was living a life that Victoria knew only fragments of. One of the recurring problems was money. Despite maintaining the image of a successful family man, Emil was struggling financially. Investigators would later discover significant debts and mounting financial pressure. Money was disappearing, bills were becoming difficult to manage, and rather than confronting those problems honestly, he increasingly relied on deception. What made the situation particularly dangerous was that the lies were rarely isolated. One lie required another, one secret created the need for a second. Before long, a pattern began to emerge. The truth became something flexible, something that could be adjusted depending on who was asking questions. To friends and colleagues, Emil often appeared confident and composed, but behind that image was growing instability, and money wasn't the only secret. As time passed, Victoria became aware that her husband was being less than honest about aspects of his personal life. Trust began to suffer, questions emerged, explanations didn't always add up. The certainty that forms the foundation of any healthy marriage started to weaken. Yet even then, there was no obvious reason to believe the relationship was beyond saving. Many marriages survive infidelity. Many marriages survive financial problems. People make mistakes. People seek counselling, people rebuild. Victoria was trying to hold on to that possibility, trying to preserve the family she had worked so hard to build. What she could not fully appreciate was the extent of the deception taking place around her. Later evidence would reveal that Emil had engaged in multiple affairs. Some relationships overlapped, some involved elaborate lies. Different people were being told different stories. In many cases, the women involved had little understanding of the wider picture. They believed they were seeing one version of Emil, not realising there were several others. It created a strange contradiction. The more chaotic his private life became, the harder he worked to maintain the appearance of normality. And for a time, it worked. At family gatherings, at work, in public, the image remained largely intact, but maintaining multiple realities requires effort. Eventually, the cracks begin to widen. By 2015, Victoria's trust in her husband had been badly damaged. There were arguments, questions, attempts to uncover the truth. The marriage was under pressure. Yet despite everything, there were still signs that Victoria wanted the relationship to survive. She wasn't preparing for the nightmare that was coming. She was trying to repair what had been broken. And that makes what happened next all the more disturbing. Because while Victoria was focusing on saving her marriage, investigators would later argue that Emil was focusing on something entirely different. The prosecution would ultimately paint a picture of a man facing growing problems on multiple fronts: financial pressures, a complicated web of affairs, a marriage in difficulty, and the possibility that the carefully crafted image he had spent years building was beginning to unravel. Whether those pressures alone explain what happened next is something listeners can consider for themselves. But one fact is impossible to ignore. In the days before Easter Sunday 2015, events took a sinister turn. A turn so alarming that many people overlooked it when discussing this case. Because before the parachute, before the fall, before the headlines, there was another incident. An incident that initially attracted little attention. An incident that could easily have been dismissed as an unfortunate accident. But once detectives began connecting the dots, it became one of the most important pieces of the entire investigation. It involved the family home, a gas leak, and a growing suspicion that Victoria Cilliers had already survived one attempt on her life. The parachute jump would make national news, but the story may actually have begun days earlier, behind the front door of an ordinary family house. When investigators first examined the Victoria Cilliers case, most of their attention naturally focused on the parachute. After all, that was the event everyone knew about. That was the event that had made national headlines. A woman falls 4,000 feet. Both parachutes fail. She somehow survives. It was the kind of story that seemed almost impossible to believe. But as detectives began digging into the weeks leading up to the skydive, they discovered another incident. One that, at first glance, appeared entirely unrelated. An incident that had occurred just days earlier inside the family home. Had Victoria died in the parachute fall, that earlier event might never have received serious scrutiny. It would likely have been written off as an unfortunate coincidence. Instead, it became one of the most chilling pieces of the prosecution's case. The incident involved gas. At some point before Easter Sunday, Victoria had begun feeling unwell. There were concerns inside the house. Eventually it was discovered that gas was escaping within the property. At face value, gas leaks are not uncommon. Faulty appliances fail, connections deteriorate, mechanical problems occur. Most are exactly what they appear to be: accidents. But investigators would later conclude that this was something very different. Evidence presented in court suggested that a gas valve had been deliberately loosened. The leak was not the result of a simple malfunction. According to the prosecution, somebody had interfered with the system, and Victoria had been inside the property while gas accumulated. The implications were deeply disturbing. A gas leak can kill. It can poison occupants gradually. It can create the conditions for a devastating explosion. Most frighteningly of all, it can do so without attracting immediate attention. People may simply feel tired, headachy, dizzy, unwell. The symptoms can easily be mistaken for something else, and that is what made the discovery so significant. When detectives later reviewed the timeline, they found themselves asking a difficult question. If the gas leak had been deliberate, was it connected to the parachute incident? Or were they dealing with two entirely separate events that had happened to involve the same woman within a matter of days? The odds seemed extraordinary. One potentially lethal incident might be bad luck. Two begins to look very different. As investigators examined the evidence, a pattern started to emerge. The gas leak had occurred first, then came the skydive. Viewed individually, each event could perhaps be explained away. Viewed together, they painted a far darker picture. A picture that suggested persistence, planning, and intent. For detectives, the case was beginning to transform. They were no longer asking whether the parachute failure had been accidental. They were asking whether Victoria had unknowingly become the target of a murder plot. Meanwhile, Victoria herself was focused on something far more immediate: recovery. The injuries she had sustained in the fall were catastrophic. Multiple fractures, extensive physical trauma, a long and painful road ahead. Her days became dominated by hospitals, surgeries, and rehabilitation. The simple act of surviving required immense effort. While she fought to rebuild her body, detectives were painstakingly rebuilding the truth. And the deeper they looked into Emile Cilliers' life, the more troubling the picture became. Financial difficulties, hidden relationships, deception, contradictions, questions that seemed to multiply with every interview. Yet none of it, on its own, proved attempted murder. Investigators still needed something more, something that directly connected a suspect to the sabotage of the parachute. That evidence would come from an unlikely source: the parachute itself. Because while Victoria lay in a hospital bed trying to recover from injuries that should have killed her, forensic specialists were conducting their own examination. Every strap, every connector, every component, every piece of equipment was being scrutinized. What they found would change the course of the investigation, because parachutes are designed with failure in mind. Skydivers know things can go wrong. That is why there are backups, safety systems, redundancies, layers of protection. For Victoria to lose both parachutes in a single jump was almost beyond comprehension. Experts needed to know why, and when they began examining the reserve parachute in detail, they discovered something that was impossible to ignore. This wasn't a case of bad luck. This wasn't wear and tear, and it wasn't a freak mechanical failure. Somebody had interfered with the equipment. The question now wasn't whether a crime had occurred. The question was who had committed it, and the answer was beginning to point towards the person closest to Victoria: her husband. The investigation was no longer looking for an explanation. It was looking for a suspect. For Victoria Cilliers, Easter Sunday 2015 was supposed to be an escape, a break from the pressures that had been building in her life, a chance to do something she loved, something familiar, something that made sense. By this point, her marriage was under strain, trust had been damaged, arguments had become more common, questions lingered unanswered. Yet despite everything, she was still trying to move forward, still trying to believe that things could improve, still trying to hold her family together. That morning, she arrived at Neverhaven Airfield. For experienced skydivers, the routine before a jump is almost second nature. Equipment checks, safety procedures, brief conversations, weather assessments, nothing is left to chance. The culture of skydiving depends on discipline. Complacency can be deadly. Victoria understood that better than most. Thousands of previous jumps had taught her the importance of preparation. Everything about the sport relies on trust. Trust in equipment, trust in procedures, trust in the people around you. What Victoria could not have known was that investigators would later argue one of those foundations had already been compromised. As preparations continued, nobody present had any reason to believe this jump would become one of the most famous in British criminal history. To everyone watching, it appeared entirely routine. Another experienced skydiver, making another jump, nothing more. The aircraft climbed steadily into the sky. Below, the Wiltshire countryside stretched towards the horizon. Fields divided by hedgerows, roads winding through villages, tiny houses scattered across the landscape. The view was spectacular. It always was. Inside the aircraft, skydivers waited for their turn. Some were excited, others focused quietly on the task ahead. For Victoria, this environment was familiar, comfortable even. The door eventually opened. A blast of cold air rushed inside. One by one, jumpers prepared themselves. Then it was Victoria's turn. She moved towards the exit, checked her position, and stepped out into open sky. At first everything felt normal. The rush of freefall, the roar of the wind, the sensation she had experienced thousands of times before. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing seemed wrong. Then came the moment every skydiver knows. The moment to deploy the main canopy. Victoria reached for the deployment handle and waited. What happened next immediately told her something was wrong. The main parachute failed to function properly. For an inexperienced skydiver, panic might have taken over. But Victoria was not inexperienced. Training took control. She followed the emergency procedures she had practiced countless times. Cut away the malfunctioned main canopy. Deploy the reserve. This was exactly why reserve parachutes exist. When all else fails, the reserve saves your life. She pulled. For a brief moment there may have been hope. Then came a second catastrophe. The reserve parachute failed. To understand how terrifying that would have been, imagine being thousands of feet above the ground and discovering that your final safety system has failed. Not the first parachute, the second, the backup, the system specifically designed for emergencies. It is also impossible to comprehend. Yet that was the reality Victoria faced. 2 failures, 2 opportunities to survive, both gone. Now there was nothing left. The ground was approaching at tremendous speed. Far below, people began noticing something unusual. Experienced observers understood quickly that something had gone wrong. Very wrong. Witnesses later described the horrifying sight of a skydiver descending without a functioning canopy. Some watched in disbelief. Others simply froze. There was nothing anyone could do. No rescue helicopter, no emergency procedure, no last-minute intervention. Gravity had taken over. And gravity never negotiates. As Victoria fell, the seconds must have felt impossibly short and impossibly long at the same time. Human beings are not supposed to survive impacts like this. The physics alone are overwhelming. The forces involved are devastating. Yet fate, chance, luck, whatever name you choose to give it, had one final surprise. Below her lay a freshly ploughed field, soft earth, recently turned soil, not concrete, not tarmac, not a building, a field. Moments later, Victoria slammed into the ground. The impact was catastrophic. Bones shattered throughout her body. Her injuries were extensive and life-threatening. For many witnesses, survival seemed impossible. Some assumed they had just watched a fatal accident. Emergency services raced towards the scene. Those first minutes were chaotic. Confusion, urgency, shock. Nobody yet understood that they were standing at the centre of a crime scene. Nobody yet understood that this fall would trigger a murder investigation. At that moment, there was only one priority: keeping Victoria alive. Against all expectations, she still was, badly injured, broken in ways that would take years to heal, but alive. As she was rushed away for treatment, investigators had no idea that one of the most important pieces of evidence was still sitting back at the airfield, the parachute itself. And when experts finally began examining it, they would discover something that transformed this case forever. Because parachutes do fail, occasionally, rarely, but they do fail. What they don't normally do is fail twice, and they certainly do not fail in the precise way Victoria's had. The equipment was about to tell a story of missing components, deliberate interference, and a level of planning that would shock even seasoned detectives. The fall was over. The investigation was only just beginning. The first battle Victoria Cilliers fought was not for justice, it was for survival. When emergency services reached the field, the fact that she was still alive was astonishing. Experienced rescuers had seen the aftermath of falls from far lower heights. They understood the odds, they understood the violence of the impact, and they understood that most people simply do not survive hitting the ground after a parachute failure. Yet somehow, Victoria had. Barely. The list of injuries was extensive. Her body had absorbed forces that should have killed her. Bones were broken throughout her frame. Her pelvis was shattered. Her spine had suffered serious damage. Her ribs were fractured. Internal injuries complicated an already desperate situation. The road ahead would be measured, not in days or weeks, but in years. As she was rushed to hospital, doctors began a race against time. Surgery followed surgery. Specialists worked to stabilise her condition. Every decision carried enormous consequences. The priority was simple: keep her alive. Everything else could wait. Family members gathered. Friends waited for updates. The uncertainty was agonising. Even those closest to Victoria could not know whether she would survive the days ahead. And if she did survive, what kind of life would remain? For a woman who had built so much of her identity around activity, adventure, and independence, the prospect of a permanent disability was terrifying. Meanwhile, outside the hospital walls, questions were beginning to emerge. Initially, the incident was viewed through the lens of an accident investigation. That made perfect sense. After all, parachute malfunctions do happen. Rarely, but they happen. Equipment can fail. Human error can occur. The skydiving community understands that no system is entirely risk-free. At first glance, this appeared to be a tragic example of those risks becoming reality. But certain details quickly caught the attention of investigators. The reserve parachute, the system designed specifically to save a skydiver's life when the primary canopy fails. Why hadn't it worked? That question became impossible to ignore. Experts began examining the equipment. The process was painstaking. Every strap, every connector, every mechanism, every component, nothing could be overlooked. What they found immediately raised concerns. Then those concerns became suspicions, and those suspicions became something far more serious. Investigators discovered that critical parts of the reserve system had been removed. Not broken, not worn out, removed. This was not the sort of damage that occurs naturally. This was not the consequence of age or bad luck. This was interference, deliberate interference. Suddenly the entire investigation changed direction. Detectives were no longer asking why a parachute had malfunctioned. They were asking who'd tampered with it. That distinction transformed everything. An accident investigation seeks explanations. A criminal investigation seeks offenders. The focus shifted rapidly. Who had access to the parachute? Who had handled it? Who had the opportunity to interfere with the equipment before the jump? The list was not enormous, and as detectives worked through the evidence, one name continued appearing. Emile Cilliers, Victoria's husband. Evidence suggested that he had access to the parachute before the jump. Witnesses recalled interactions that suddenly seemed more significant than they had at the time. Small details, small observations, the kind that often appear meaningless until viewed through the lens of a criminal investigation. But there was another complication, perhaps the most emotionally difficult aspect of the entire case. Victoria herself struggled to accept the possibility that her husband could be responsible. It's easy looking back to assume the conclusion should have been obvious, but human relationships are rarely that simple. When somebody has shared your home, your bed, your life and your children, accepting that they may have tried to kill you is almost unimaginable. Many victims of deception face the same dilemma. The evidence points in one direction, their emotions point in another. Victoria had spent years building a life with Emile. The idea that he could have engineered her death was not merely shocking, it threatened to destroy her entire understanding of the life she thought she had been living. While detectives became increasingly suspicious, Victoria was still processing the possibility itself, and that tension would become a recurring theme throughout the investigation, because the police believed they were uncovering evidence of attempted murder. But the victim was still struggling to believe the suspect could be guilty. Meanwhile, detectives were uncovering more information about Emile's private life, information that painted a picture very different from the image he presented publicly. Affairs, financial difficulties, lies, manipulation. The deeper investigators looked, the more complicated the picture became. Then they discovered something that pushed the case into even darker territory. The parachute might not have been the first attempt. Days before the skydive, there had been a gas leak. What initially appeared to be an unrelated incident was now being re-examined alongside everything else, and investigators were beginning to suspect a horrifying possibility. What if Victoria had survived not one attempt on her life, but two? The case was becoming larger, darker, more deliberate, and the evidence was beginning to point towards a man living a double life that few people fully understood. To uncover the truth, detectives would have to pull that life apart, piece by piece, and what they found would reveal a web of secrets far more extensive than anyone had imagined. As detectives dug deeper into Emile Cilliers' life, a troubling pattern began to emerge. At first, the pieces seemed disconnected. A debt here, an affair there, a lie told to a colleague, a different lie told to a family member. Individually, none of it proved attempted murder. But investigations are often like jigsaw puzzles. The picture only becomes clear when enough pieces are placed together, and the more detectives uncovered, the more they began to see a man who was carefully managing multiple versions of himself. To one person, he was a devoted husband. To another, he was trapped in an unhappy marriage. To someone else, he was a loving father trying to do his best. The stories changed depending on who was listening. The image changed depending on who was watching. What remained constant was the deception. As officers examined phone records, financial records and witness statements, they discovered that Emile had been conducting numerous affairs. Some women knew very little about his real circumstances. Others had been given stories that were at best heavily distorted. The relationships overlapped, promises were made, false impressions created. Reality became increasingly difficult to separate from fiction. For detectives, this wasn't simply gossip or evidence of martial problems. It revealed something important about character: a willingness to manipulate, a willingness to lie repeatedly, a willingness to tell people whatever they needed to hear. And that willingness extended beyond his personal relationships. Money was becoming another significant concern. Behind the respectable image of a serving army sergeant, financial pressures were mounting. Investigators discovered debts, borrowing, growing economic problems. The details painted a picture of someone struggling to maintain a lifestyle that reality could no longer comfortably support. Again, debt alone doesn't make somebody a killer. Thousands of people experience financial difficulties without committing crimes. But when detectives are trying to understand motive, money inevitably becomes part of the conversation, particularly when life insurance enters the picture. As investigators examined the family's finances, they discovered policies that would have provided significant payouts in the event of Victoria's death. The existence of life insurance is entirely normal. Millions of families have it. The important question is not whether it existed. The important question is how it fits into the wider picture. And in this case, prosecutors would later argue that it formed part of a compelling motive. A man facing mounting pressures, a marriage in trouble, financial difficulties, multiple affairs, and a substantial insurance payout if his wife died. It was a theory that investigators increasingly found difficult to ignore. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the investigation wasn't the money. It wasn't even the affairs. It was the apparent absence of genuine concern. As officers reviewed behaviour before and after the parachute incident, they began noticing moments that felt unusual, moments that seemed out of place, moments that would later be scrutinised in court. People naturally expect a husband, whose wife has narrowly survived a catastrophic accident, to display overwhelming relief, desperation, fear, grief. Instead, investigators found themselves examining behaviour that some witnesses considered strange. Not enough to prove guilt, but enough to raise questions. And those questions kept accumulating. Every new lead seemed to produce another inconsistency, another contradiction, another concern. Then there was the parachute itself, the most important piece of physical evidence in the entire case. Forensic experts had already established that this was not a simple equipment failure. Critical components of the reserve parachute had been removed. The system had been compromised. But detectives now needed to answer a crucial question. Who had done it? Opportunity became everything. Investigators reconstructed the days leading up to the jump. Who had access to the equipment? Who could have handled it? Who had the time and ability to interfere with it without attracting attention? As they worked through those questions, the circle began to narrow. And it kept narrowing towards the same individual, Victoria Cilliers. The case against him wasn't built on a single dramatic revelation. It wasn't one smoking gun. It was a mosaic, a collection of facts, circumstances and evidence that prosecutors believed pointed in one direction. The gas leak, the parachute, the affairs, the debts, the insurance, the lies. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Yet there was still one enormous challenge facing investigators: building a case strong enough to convince a jury. Suspicion is not evidence. Theory is not proof. Detectives may have believed they understood what had happened, but in a courtroom, belief means very little. They needed evidence, hard evidence, evidence capable of surviving the scrutiny of defence lawyers, expert witnesses, and 12 jurors. And so the investigation intensified. Witnesses were interviewed, experts consulted, digital evidence analysed, financial records examined. Every aspect of Emil's life was placed under a microscope. The result would be one of the most detailed and complex attempted murder investigations in recent British criminal history. Eventually, detectives became convinced they had enough evidence to charge, enough evidence to place a serving army sergeant in the dock, enough evidence to argue that Victoria Cilliers' fall from the sky had not been an accident at all. But securing a charge was only the beginning. The real battle was still to come, because now the case would move into a courtroom, and there every piece of evidence would be tested, every allegation challenged, every assumption questioned. The prosecution believed they were about to expose a carefully planned murder plot. The defence insisted there was another explanation. The truth would ultimately be decided by a jury, and the road to that verdict would be anything but straightforward. By the time detectives decided to charge Emile Cilliers, they believed they understood what had happened. But understanding a crime and proving a crime are two different things. In the world of criminal investigations, suspicion is only the beginning. A jury cannot convict someone because detectives believe they're guilty. A jury must be persuaded by evidence, and the evidence in this case would have to withstand intense scrutiny. From the very beginning, investigators knew they faced a challenge. There was no confession, no eyewitnesses had seen anyone tampering with the parachute. There was no CCTV recording showing the sabotage taking place. The prosecution's case would need to be built piece by piece, fact by fact, layer by layer. The most important evidence came from the parachute itself. Specialist examiners spent countless hours analysing the equipment. Their findings were deeply significant. The reserve parachute had not failed because of wear and tear. It had not failed because of an obscure manufacturing defect. Critical connecting links, known as slinks, had been deliberately removed. Without them, the reserve canopy could not function as intended. The system that should have saved Victoria's life had effectively been rendered useless. Experts would later tell the jury that this was not something that could happen accidentally during normal use. Somebody had interfered with the equipment. The question was who? Detectives turned their attention to opportunity. The parachute had not been accessible to a large number of people. It had spent time in storage. It had been handled by relatively few individuals. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, they focused on who had access in the days before the jump. Again and again the evidence led them back to Emile. Witness statements became increasingly important. Some recalled seeing him around the equipment. Others remembered behaviour that seemed insignificant at the time, but appeared far more relevant once the investigation began. Individually, these observations might have meant little. Together, they helped build a picture. Then there was the gas leak. Initially investigated as a separate incident, detectives now viewed it as part of the same story. Experts examined the valve involved. The evidence suggested deliberate interference rather than accidental failure. For investigators, the significance was enormous, because if the gas leak had also been engineered, it suggested planning, persistence, a willingness to try again after an earlier attempt had failed. That transformed the narrative of the case. This was no longer a single alleged act. The prosecution would argue that it was a sequence of deliberate actions aimed at achieving the same outcome: Victoria's death. Meanwhile, officers continued exploring motive. Financial records revealed debt. The scale of some of the financial difficulties surprised even seasoned investigators. Money was clearly a source of pressure. Then came evidence relating to life insurance. Policies that could potentially provide financial benefit following Victoria's death. Again, the existence of insurance proved nothing by itself, but prosecutors believed it formed part of a broader picture, one that became harder to ignore with each new discovery. The affairs also became relevant, not because infidelity is a crime, it isn't, but because the relationships revealed the extent of the deception. The prosecution would argue that Emile had become trapped in a life built on lies, a life that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. As trial preparations continued, detectives interviewed friends, colleagues and former partners. Many described a charming individual, confident, persuasive, capable of making people trust him. Yet beneath that charm, investigators believed there was something darker, something hidden. The challenge now was translating years of investigative work into a case that 12 ordinary jurors would understand. Every detail needed to be explained, every expert conclusion supported, every allegation backed by evidence. Nothing could be assumed, nothing could be taken for granted. The defence, meanwhile, was preparing its own response, because while prosecutors believed the evidence pointed clearly towards attempted murder, the defence would challenge those conclusions at every stage. Could the parachute have failed for another reason? Could the prosecution be interpreting events incorrectly? Were investigators seeing connections that didn't actually exist? These questions would soon be placed before a jury, and the stakes could not have been higher. For Victoria, the case had become about more than physical survival. It was now about understanding what had happened to her, about discovering whether the man she had trusted most had really tried to kill her. For detectives, years of work were about to face their ultimate test, and for Emile Cilliers, the next chapter would determine whether he walked free or faced the possibility of spending decades behind bars. The courtroom battle was about to begin, but what happened next would surprise almost everyone involved, because despite the mountain of evidence, the first jury would not deliver the verdict many expected. In October 2017, more than 2 years after Victoria Cilliers fell from the sky, the case finally arrived in court. By then, it had already become one of the most unusual criminal investigations in modern Britain. The allegations sounded almost unbelievable. A serving army sergeant accused of attempting to murder his wife, not with a gun, not with a knife, but by sabotaging a parachute. The prosecution's task was clear: convince 12 jurors that what had happened to Victoria was not an accident, convince them that the evidence pointed to one man, and convince them that the sabotage had been deliberate. Inside the courtroom, the story that emerged was both fascinating and disturbing. Jurors heard about Victoria's military career, her experience as a skydiver, the thousands of successful jumps she had completed before Easter Sunday 2015. The prosecution argued that this experience was important. Victoria wasn't reckless, she wasn't careless, she knew her equipment, she understood safety procedures. The suggestion that she had somehow caused the failure herself simply didn't fit the evidence. Then came the technical testimony. Experts explained the parachute system. They walked jurors through the equipment piece by piece. The evidence showed that critical components had been removed from the reserve parachute. Not damaged, not worn out, removed. The distinction was crucial. The prosecution argued that the reserve had effectively been turned into a deadly trap, a backup system that would never function properly when needed. Jurors also heard evidence relating to the main canopy. Together, the failures created a picture that experts described as extraordinarily unusual. The prosecution's position was simple. This wasn't bad luck, this wasn't coincidence, this wasn't sabotage. Then attention turned to motive. The jury heard about financial problems, mounting debts, the complicated web of affairs, the double life that investigators believed Emile had been living. Witnesses described lies, manipulation, relationships built on false promises and false identities. The prosecution painted a picture of a man under pressure, a man whose carefully constructed world was beginning to unravel. Life insurance evidence was also presented. Again, prosecutors weren't suggesting insurance alone proved guilt, but they argued it formed part of a wider context, part of the explanation for why somebody might want Victoria dead. Then came one of the most striking elements of the case, the gas leak. Jurors learned that before the parachute incident, there had already been another potentially fatal event at the family home. Prosecutors argued that this was not an isolated incident. Instead, they claimed it represented an earlier attempt to kill Victoria, a failed attempt followed by another. The implication was chilling. According to the prosecution, the parachute evidence was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was part of a pattern, part of a plan, part of a deliberate effort to bring about Victoria's death. Throughout the proceedings, Emile denied the allegations. The defence challenged the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence. They questioned assumptions, raised doubts, suggested alternative explanations. As with any serious criminal trial, the burden remained entirely on the prosecution. They had to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Nothing less would be enough. As the weeks passed, jurors absorbed enormous quantities of evidence, expert testimony, technical analysis, financial records, witness statements, thousands of details that needed to be considered carefully. Eventually, the case was handed to the jury. The prosecution believed they had presented a compelling case. Detectives felt confident in the investigation. Many observers expected a verdict. But the legal system doesn't operate on expectations. It operates on decisions made by juries. And when the jury returned, they delivered a result that stunned many people. They could not agree. There would be no verdict, no conviction, no acquittal. The jury was discharged. The trial had ended without a resolution. For Victoria, it was a devastating outcome. For detectives, it was deeply frustrating. Years of work had not produced the conclusion they had hoped for. Yet the case was far from over. Prosecutors remained convinced of the strength of the evidence. Rather than abandon the case, they made a significant decision. They would try again. A second trial would be held. A new jury would hear the evidence. A new jury would decide Emile Cilliers' fate. And this time, the outcome would be very different. Because the retrial would finally provide an answer to the question that had haunted the case from the very beginning. Was Victoria Cilliers the victim of a tragic accident, or had somebody deliberately tried to murder her? The next jury would decide, and their verdict would change everything. When the decision was made to hold a retrial, both sides knew what was at stake. For the prosecution, it was another opportunity to present the case they believed proved beyond doubt that Victoria Cilliers had been the victim of attempted murder. For the defence, it was a second chance to challenge that conclusion. And for Victoria, it meant reliving some of the most traumatic events of her life all over again. Once again, a jury was asked to examine the evidence. Once again, experts explained how the parachute had been sabotaged. Once again, prosecutors laid out what they believed was a clear pattern of behaviour: the gas leak, the parachute, the affairs, the debts, the insurance, the lies. Separately, each element raised questions. Together, prosecutors argued they pointed towards a single conclusion. This had not been an accident. This had been attempted murder. The retrial lasted for weeks. Witnesses returned, experts returned. The evidence was scrutinised once more. Nothing was taken for granted. Every detail mattered. As the proceedings continued, the prosecution focused heavily on planning and intent. They argued that the sabotage required deliberate action, that it required opportunity, and that the person responsible had understood precisely what they were doing. The defence maintained that the prosecution's interpretation of events was flawed, that suspicion was being mistaken for proof, that the evidence did not establish guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The arguments were familiar, but now they were being considered by a new jury. Eventually the evidence concluded, the speeches were delivered, the judge provided directions, and once again, 12 jurors retired to deliberate. For everyone involved, the wait was agonising. Victoria waited, detectives waited, lawyers waited, reporters waited, and Emile Cilliers waited. This time, however, the jury reached a decision. In May 2018, Emile Cilliers was found guilty of attempting to murder Victoria through the sabotage of her parachute, guilty of attempting to murder her through the gas leak at the family home. The verdict marked the end of one of the most remarkable attempted murder cases Britain had seen in years. For investigators, it was confirmation that years of work had been justified. For prosecutors, it was vindication of the case they had fought so hard to present. For Victoria, the emotions were far more complicated. Relief, shock, validation, grief. The conviction answered the legal questions, but it could never fully answer the personal one. How does somebody come to terms with the fact that the person they loved and trusted most had tried to kill them? That question doesn't disappear when a verdict is announced. It lingers, sometimes for years. When sentencing took place, the judge delivered a damning assessment of Emile's actions. The court heard that the offences involved significant planning and deception. This was not a momentary lapse of judgment. This was not an impulsive act. The judge described the crimes as carefully calculated attempts to end Victoria's life. Emile Cilliers was sentenced to life imprisonment. A minimum term of 18 years was imposed before he could even be considered for release. As he was led away, the legal battle that had dominated so many lives finally came to an end. But the story itself was not over, because while the conviction closed one chapter, another was just beginning. The years after the fall would force Victoria to confront challenges that no court could solve. The physical recovery, the emotional recovery, the rebuilding of trust, the task of creating a future from the wreckage of the past. Many victims never receive answers. Many never see justice. Victoria had both. Yet surviving a murder attempt and winning a court case are not the same thing as healing. The scars remained, some visible, many invisible. And as she began rebuilding her life, she would discover that surviving the fall was only the first part of her journey. The second part was learning how to live again. After everything that had happened, after the lies, after the betrayal, after the man she loved had been exposed as a man who had tried to kill her, and in many ways, that journey would prove every bit as remarkable as surviving the fall itself. For many true crime stories, the verdict is the ending. The guilty party is convicted, the sentence is handed down, the courtroom empties, the story is over. But for the people who lived through it, life doesn't end when a judge leaves the bench. In many ways, that's where the hardest part begins. For Victoria Cilliers, surviving the fall had been extraordinary, but survival and recovery are not the same thing. The physical injuries she suffered were devastating. Months became years. Operations were followed by rehabilitation. Rehabilitation was followed by setbacks. Simple movements that most people take for granted became challenges. Pain became a constant companion. The body can heal, but it rarely heals quickly, and sometimes it never heals completely. Yet the physical recovery was only part of the story. There was another wound that could not be seen on an X-ray, a wound that no surgeon could repair. Betrayal. When Victoria stepped from that aircraft in April 2015, she believed she understood her life. She believed she understood her marriage. She believed she understood the man she had built a family with. The investigation shattered those beliefs. The trial shattered them completely. The person who should have been her greatest source of safety had become the greatest threat she had ever faced. Coming to terms with that reality took time, a great deal of time. People often ask why victims don't immediately recognize manipulation, why they don't simply walk away, why they struggle to accept the truth. The answer is usually because relationships are built over years, trust is built over years, love is built over years, and when somebody manipulates that trust, they rarely do it all at once. They do it gradually, carefully, often so slowly that the victim doesn't realize what is happening until the damage has already been done. As Victoria reflected on her marriage, many events began to look different. Conversations, arguments, promises, excuses, things that once seemed ordinary suddenly appeared in a new light. The truth, when it finally emerged, forced her to re-examine years of her own life. That process was painful, but it was also necessary, because healing requires understanding, and understanding sometimes requires confronting uncomfortable realities. In the years that followed, Victoria spoke openly about coercive control and manipulation, not because it was easy, but because she recognized something important. Her story wasn't unique. The details were extraordinary: the parachute, the gas leak, the dramatic court case. Few people will ever experience those things, but deception, control, and emotional manipulation are far more common than many realize. Behind closed doors, countless victims struggle with behaviors that are difficult to identify and even harder to explain. By speaking about her experiences, Victoria helps shine a light on those hidden realities. And perhaps that is one of the most important legacies of this case. Not simply that a crime was solved, not simply that a conviction was secured, but that a conversation was started. A conversation about trust, about control, about the warning signs that can exist behind apparently normal lives. Because one of the most unsettling aspects of this story is how ordinary it appeared at first. There were no obvious monsters, no dramatic warning signs visible to the outside world, no clear indication that a woman was allegedly being targeted by the person closest to her. The danger was hidden, which in many ways is exactly what makes this case so frightening. The title of this podcast is What They Hide, and few cases embody that idea more completely than this one. Behind the photographs was deception, behind the marriage was betrayal, behind the smiles was a secret life, and behind what appeared to be a tragic accident was, according to a jury, an attempted murder. Yet despite everything, that isn't the lasting image of the story. Not for me. The last image is not of a sabotaged parachute, it's not of a courtroom, and it's not of a prison sentence. It's of a woman lying broken in a Wiltshire field, who somehow refused to die. A woman who survived a fall that should have killed her. A woman who endured years of recovery. A woman who rebuilt her life after discovering that the person she trusted most had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Many people would have been defined by that experience. Victoria refused to be. And perhaps that's why this story continues to resonate with so many people. Because at its heart, it isn't really a story about falling. It's a story about getting back up. Thank you for listening to What They Hide, Hidden Crimes in Plain Sight. I've been your host, Matt. If you'd like to support the show, you'll find the Buy Me a Coffee link in the episode description. Please consider following, rating and sharing the podcast, as it genuinely helps more people discover these stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, sometimes the truth isn't what people show us, it's what they hide.